A young girl searching for answers, a Hollywood icon with a message to share this poignant encounter will stay with you long after it's over. The golden light of the late afternoon bathed a quiet corner of Santa Monica outside a humble cafe, nestled between a second-hand store and a laundromat. Mel Gibson sat with his coffee, sunglasses resting low on his nose, dressed casually in a navy t-shirt and jeans. He blended in with the locals, savoring a moment of solitude, but in Santa Monica, peace is often short-lived, especially in the vibrant bustle of these streets. A figure appeared, stepping out from the shadows, a young girl, no older than 13, barefoot, clutching a worn backpack. Her messy brown hair framed a face burdened with a weariness far beyond her years. She stopped just a few feet from Mel, her eyes nervously scanning him, as though unsure whether she should speak. "Excuse me," she said finally, her voice quiet yet steady. Mel glanced up, raising an eyebrow in mild surprise. She hesitated, fiddling with the frayed strap of her bag. Do you know who Jesus Christ is?" The question landed like a lightning strike, cutting through the hum of nearby pedestrians and distant traffic. For a moment, Mel was silent, his hand frozen in midair, the coffee cup hovering just before his lips. He studied her, truly seeing her, into eyes that reflected both innocence and untold hardships. "Why do you ask?" he asked gently, setting his cup down, his voice warm with no trace of judgment, only curiosity. The girl shrugged, shifting uncomfortably. "People talk about him, I don't know who he is, do you?" But before Mel could answer, something in the girl's expression stopped him. It wasn't a casual question, it was a silent plea for something more. He leaned back, interlocking his fingers, studying her closely. She looked so small standing there, her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. Her question wasn't random. He sensed there was something deeper, something raw behind it. "Yeah," Mel finally said, his voice calm but deliberate. "I know him." The girl's eyes flickered with a spark of hope, but she quickly hid it with a practiced indifference. She hugged her backpack tighter, tilting her head. "What's he like?" Mel was taken aback by the simplicity and gravity of her question. He glanced around, noticing a few people slowing their pace, pretending not to listen, while an odd tension seemed to fill the air, drawing all attention to their exchange. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Want to sit?" The girl hesitated, her gaze shifting between the chair and Mel as if weighing the risk of a trap or an act of kindness. After a moment, she shuffled forward and sat at the edge of the seat, ready to flee at a moment's notice. "Look," Mel began, his voice softening. "I'm not some preacher or anything, but to me, Jesus is someone who doesn't give up on you no matter how messed up life gets. He's about forgiveness, about starting over, even when you think it's too late." The girl looked down, tracing invisible lines on the table with her finger. "Starting over, huh?" she muttered almost to herself. Mel leaned forward slightly. "Yeah, starting over. You ever feel like you need that?" She didn't answer immediately, instead staring at her hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "but I don't think it works for people like me." Mel didn't let her words hang in the air. He responded without hesitation, his voice steady and unwavering. "Why not?" His question cut through her doubts like a light in the darkness. The girl shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I've done bad things, stuff I'm not proud of. People don't look at someone like me and think I deserve a fresh start." Mel let her words settle, his expression soft but serious. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers gently on the edge of the table. "You know," he began quietly, "I used to think that way too." Her eyes shot up, surprise and maybe disbelief written on her face. "You?" she asked, almost incredulously. "Yeah, me," he replied, letting out a small, humorless chuckle. "I've made mistakes, big ones, hurt people I cared about. There were times I thought I'd never climb out of the hole I dug for myself, but I realized something. It's not about deserving it, Nobody deserves grace. That's what makes it grace. The girl frowned, as if the concept were just out of her reach. So, you just got forgiven, just like that? Mel shook his head. It wasn't that simple, he admitted. It took time, a lot of time and a lot of hard work. I had to face parts of myself I didn't want to see. I had to ask for forgiveness, not just from God, but from the people I hurt. And let me tell you, he leaned forward, his voice lowering. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The girl looked at him now with more intent, her earlier skepticism fading away. What made you want to change? She asked. Mel paused, his eyes drifting to the horizon as if searching for the right words. I hit rock bottom, he said finally. And when you're at the bottom, there's only one way to goop. But you can't do it alone. That's what I had to learn. She nodded slowly, not because she fully understood, but because she was starting to. There was a weight to his words, raw and unpolished, but undeniably real. Before she could respond, a slight commotion broke the moment. A few strangers had stopped nearby, their curious eyes flickering between Mel and the girl, drawn by the unexpected intimacy of their conversation. The girl glanced over her shoulder at the small gathering, a man in a grey suit, a couple holding hands, and an older woman with grocery soul of them subtly lingering, eager to catch a glimpse of the exchange. Mel noticed, but didn't seem to mind. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, unbothered. His focus wavered. You see, he continued, speaking as if only to the girl, sometimes when you think no one's watching, that's when life surprises you. People notice things. They notice moments like this. The girl looked unconvinced. They're just being nosy, she muttered, bitterness in her voice. Maybe, Mel replied with a shrug. Or maybe they're looking for something just like you are, hope. A reason to believe things can get better. The girl stared at him, her expression softening slightly. Do you really think things can get better for anyone? I don't think, Mel said firmly. I know. A woman from the small crowd, curiosity getting the better of her, stepped closer. Excuse me, she said hesitantly, clutching her grocery bag. Are you talking about faith? Mel turned to her, offering a polite nod. We are, he said evenly, and how it can help you climb out of some pretty deep holes. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. I needed to hear that today, she whispered, almost to herself. The girl observed this interaction, her posture relaxing a little. It was as though the presence of others validated her doubts and questions. She leaned forward, her voice quieter now. So, what if you don't know where to start? What do you do? Mel met her gaze, his voice calm and steady. You start where you are, with what you have. Even if it's just a question, that's enough. But the girl didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat quietly, tracing the edge of the table with her fingers, as if considering whether to believe him or retreat back into the shell she'd built to survive. Her fingers stilled, and her eyes flickered with something unspoken. Finally, she asked, Have you ever been so lost you couldn't even see the way out? Like it's not even there? Mel's expression shifted, a shadow of pain crossing his face. He nodded slowly, the weight of her question settling over him. Yeah, he said quietly. I've been there. There were nights when I felt like I'd never find my way back, like no one would care if I didn't. The girl swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to her lap. Her voice trembled as she whispered, That's how I feel all the time. For a moment, the noise of the street seemed to fade, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Mel leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. You're wrong, he said. You may not see it now, but there are people who care. And even if it's just one person, sometimes that's enough to pull you back. Her gaze lifted to meet his, vulnerability shining through. A crack appeared in the armor she had worn for so long. How do you know? She asked, her voice barely audible. Mel hesitated, his hand brushing the edge of his coffee cup. Because I've lived it, he said quietly. There was a time when I thought I'd lost everything, my career, my family, my dignity. But someone believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself, and that's what saved me." The girl furrowed her brow, her mind racing to process his words. "Who was it?" she asked. Mel smiled faintly. "A friend," he said simply. "Someone who didn't give up on me, even when I gave up on myself." The girl's lips parted as if to speak, but before she could, one of the onlookers chimed in. "Sounds like you've been through a lot," the man in the gray suit said, his tone a mix of curiosity and respect. Mel nodded, glancing at the growing crowd. "We all go through a lot," he replied. "But it's not about what happens to us. It's about how we choose to respond. You can let it break you, or you can let it build you." As the words left his mouth, the girl's eyes filled with tears, her walls crumbling in a way that was both terrifying and freeing. The tears slid silently down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of her oversized hoodie. Her voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "What if you're too broken to fix? What if it's just too late?" Mel's eyes softened. His tone steady but filled with conviction, he said, "It's never too late. Not for you, not for anyone. The cracks, the breaks, they're just part of your story. They don't define you. What defines you is what you do next." The girl shook her head, her fingers tightening around the frayed strap of her backpack. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her voice trembling. "Being invisible, like you don't matter, like no one sees you." Mel leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I see you," he said, "and you matter. You matter more than you know." The girl's breath caught, and for a moment she looked like she might run. But something about his words, maybe the way he spoke them, kept her rooted to the chair. She looked down at her hands, her voice trembling as she asked, "What do I do? How do I start?" Mel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here," he said. "They can help you get back on your feet. It's not easy, but it's a start. And if you ever need someone to talk to..." He scribbled something on the back of the paper, a phone number. "Call me, okay?" The girl stared at the paper, her fingers hesitant before picking it up. "You'd really help me?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. "Absolutely," Mel said without hesitation. "Someone helped me when I needed it, and now it's my turn to do the same." The girl's lips quivered as she clutched the paper tightly. For the first time, there was a spark of hope in her eyes, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. But before she could say anything more, a voice from the crowd interrupted, breaking the moment but not the impact of what had just unfolded. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his expression a mix of awe and emotion. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, addressing Mel, looking at the girl. "It's inspiring." Mel looked up at the man, a hint of a smile on his face. "It's not about inspiration," he said simply. "It's about doing what's right. Sometimes people just need someone to remind them they're not alone." The man nodded, clearly moved, and took a step back, blending back into the crowd. The girl, still clutching the paper, glanced at the crowd. For the first time, she didn't seem afraid of their attention. Instead, she sat up straighter, as if realizing she wasn't invisible anymore. She turned back to Mel, her voice softer but steadier. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for everything." Mel nodded. "You've got this," he said, "one step at a time. Just don't give up, no matter how hard it gets." She stood slowly, her movements uncertain but deliberate. The crowd parted as she walked away, her bare feet moving purposefully down the sidewalk. Several people watched her go, their faces reflecting the weight of what they had witnessed. Mel sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He picked up his coffee again, but it had gone cold. Not that it mattered, he wasn't thinking about the coffee. His mind was on the girl and the question she had asked, a question that had peeled back layers of his own life that he hadn't planned to revisit. But just as he thought the moment was over, An older woman from the crowd leaned in, her eyes glistening with emotion. "That was beautiful," she said quietly. "I think you gave all of us something to think about." Mel offered the older woman a small, appreciative nod. "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "the smallest moments can make the biggest difference." That girl reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, how powerful a question can be. The woman smiled gently, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "It's rare to see someone take the time to listen like you did. She'll remember this forever." As the crowd began to disperse, Mel sat quietly for a moment, watching the girl's figure grow smaller in the distance. The paper he had given her seemed like such a small thing, but he knew it could mean the world to someone who needed it. He hoped she would hold on to it, not just the address or the number, but the belief that someone out there cared. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the cafe patio. Mel finally stood, leaving a generous tip on the table before heading toward his car. His heart felt lighter, though he couldn't fully explain why. Perhaps it was the girl's courage to ask the question, or maybe it was the way the crowd had been moved, or perhaps it was the simple reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always a glimmer of light. As he opened his car door, he glanced back one last time, his mind replaying her words. "What if you're too broken to fix?" He shook his head softly. "No one is ever too broken to find their way back. That's the beauty of grace." To the viewers watching this story, take a moment to reflect. You never know what someone is going through, and sometimes the smallest gesture, a kind word, a listening ear, or just showing someone they're not invisible can change their life. Be that light for someone. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more stories that remind us of the power of kindness, faith, and human connection. Because, in the end, it's these moments that bring us closer to understanding what really matters.